10 years ago today, a Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, a fatal act of defiance and despair that ignited a movement across the region. Following Bouazizi's self-immolation, protests mushroomed across the Middle East, toppling authoritarian regimes. But after a decade of war and government crackdowns, what is left of the Arab Spring? Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley and Sarah Leah Whitson, the executive director for the nonprofit organization Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN in short. The group was founded by the murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi before he was killed by Saudi agents. Matt, let me begin with you. I know that you and I have crisscrossed the region over the past 10 years, covering various parts of the Arab Spring. Walk us through the significance of this day 10 years ago and what would happen afterwards.
Well, this was the day, as you know very well, that Mohamed Bouazizi set fire to himself in an intention to kill himself in the small city of Sidi Bou Zaid in Tunisia. He died a month later, and his funeral turned into a protest, and that toppled the regime of Zinedine Ben Ali. And really, that was such a momentous occasion, and it spread throughout the Arab world, first to Egypt, where protesters gathered in Tahrir Square. You and I were both there, and waited until they saw Hosni Mubarak, who was the longtime autocrat ruler of Egypt, finally step down. And that moment, that was such an unparalleled situation in the Arab world. It spread like wildfire throughout the entire region. Now, what's left 10 years later? Well, a lot of people would say that the Arab Spring is still going on, but you still have civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Egypt tasted a bit of democracy, and then it now is in the hands of another military-backed ruler who's very close friends with President Trump. The only countries that really did well here, Eamon, are the really rich Gulf Arab countries: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. These countries, with the withering of the sort of traditional Arab Spring countries, they've really strengthened themselves. And that's why we've really started to see them asserting themselves on the world stage. But, by just about every other metric, Eamon, the situation in the Arab world has either stayed the same or gone backwards. All of the metrics, all of the reasons why there were protesters in the streets throughout the Arab world: corruption, political oppression, police brutality, lack of employment opportunities for young people especially, all of those things are either the same or much, much, much worse. So really, the Arab world could unite again, just like Mohamed Bouazizi did it back 10 years ago, and it really would just take the right spark.
So to that, Sarah, to that point that Matt just talked about, let's talk a little bit about legacy. Reflecting back, do you see any rays of hope left from the Arab Spring?
Absolutely. I think we have to see the Arab uprisings as a process that's still unfolding, a process that's still underway, with autocratic, corrupt governments playing whack-a-mole. Where they crush an uprising of people in Egypt or Bahrain, it pops up in Sudan and Algeria and Iraq and Lebanon. The minute there is any breathing space for the people of the region, they demand change. And I think that there's no going back from that. The governments that remain in power, the counter-revolutionary military coups that have taken place, the petrodollar-fueled dictator kings and emirs, they know that they are very insecure, very weak, and a surprise away from crumbling. I think that reflects their paranoia, their extreme repression, because they know that they're in a zero-sum game. It's either them or it's democracy and the will of their people.
There have been in the past few weeks some protests in small towns in Tunisia against issues of joblessness and inequality, the same kinds of economic hardships that fueled these protests a decade ago. And it's a question that I get asked a lot, which is, why didn't the Arab Spring deliver in a country like Tunisia? What didn't the Arab Spring, Sarah, succeed in building prosperous democracies? And how did muddled reactions to the uprisings from the U.S. and Europe, if at all, contribute to this?
Well, I wish democracy was a magic wand for prosperity, but sadly we know from many very impoverished democratic states that that's not the case. The situation in Tunisia is that it was a very poor country before the uprisings, and it remains quite a poor country now, sadly, without the petrodollars that allow other governments to survive. I wish there was greater support from the international community for the prosperity of Tunisians, for investment in jobs, but there's been very little, unfortunately, certainly nothing to reflect the incredible success that the Tunisian people have delivered not just for their own country, but for the entire Arab world. And no country is able to survive nowadays purely on its own. And we need to do a much better job of integrating Tunisia into the global economy such that its people can have fair jobs and a fair standard of living.
Let's look ahead really quickly, if we can, Sarah, to the incoming administration. And on that note, we talked about President Trump speaking to King Salman of Saudi Arabia. They've had a very cozy relationship throughout the past 4 years. You know that better than anyone. But a lot of this began, obviously, during the Obama-Biden years in 2008. What do you think the Biden administration should do when they take office come January 20th, 2021?
Well, I think what they should do, what they promised to do, is to dramatically change our relationship with abusive governments, such as Saudi Arabia, such as the UAE. President-elect Biden very clearly promised in November 2019 to cut arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to re-examine our relationships with authoritarian abusive governments. That's clearly what he should do because it's the right thing to do, and it's in the U.S. interest not to support abuses in the region, not to be tarred and blemished with their crimes, and not to contribute and make things worse, as the United States has been doing. However, I think that President-elect Biden is going to face extreme challenges not to do that, because the so-called normalization deals between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel, now including Sudan and Morocco, probably likely to include Saudi Arabia at some point, is basically going to strengthen the lobbyists who push for close relations with these autocratic governments. So in addition to the military defense industrial complex, who will continue to lobby for arms sales, now we will see the Israel lobby pushing hard for continued close relationships with these abusive governments, as they've already been doing in connection with the UAE arms deal that's discussed in the Senate just a week and a half ago.
Hard to imagine that it has been 10 years. So much has changed, and yet so little in some regards. Sarah Leah Whitson, Matt Bradley, thank you to both of you on this day for joining us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.